Okay, good morning, everyone. So some of you know me. For those who do not, my name is Heather Spellman. I am a research data manager here at Brown Health on the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, Research Design, and Informatics Core, better known as BIRDie, and I lead the Data Planning and Stewardship program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the program, the data sharing process, some best practices, considerations, and share some resources with you as well. So the major teams involved are BIRDie, Grants and Contracts, HRPP, and IS Research Computing. And we also, as needed, consult with corporate compliance, risk management, and legal. Current practice is all outgoing research data or reciprocal data sharing that includes data that's leaving the institution requires a data transfer and use agreement, regardless of data type. So this includes fully de-identified data as well. All incoming data follows the requirements of the provider, so it's at the discretion of your collaborator whether they will require one to be in place if we're the recipient. The one thing I'll say is if we are receiving any identifiable data, chances are they will require one. All data sharing currently related to research comes through the DPSP. The only exception to this is fully industry-sponsored research, which is managed by the Clinical Trial Office. We hope one day to integrate that into DPSP, but right now we just don't have the bandwidth, and most industry-sponsored research is covered by clinical trial agreements. If it's a combination and there's federal funding involved, it will come through us. So we consult with researchers, create a data management and sharing plan or help them edit one, provide guidance, determine the need for a DTUA, help prepare, edit, review the DTUA for completeness and accuracy, review IRB documentation for the same and also consistency, collaborate with the teams above, and document and track outcomes. So the objectives and approach, comprehensive planning as early as possible. This is number one. In a perfect world, we would love to be able to meet with researchers before you've even submitted to the IRB, but we know that's not always possible. But when it is, it's great because we can help you ensure that your data sharing agreement and your IRB are in sync and everything is, all your ducks are in a row. Ensure consistency between your IRB approved protocol, consent, if applicable, DTUA, and institutional capabilities, policies, and practices. Integrated review and collaboration, support, educate, and advocate for the research community, learn and adapt, and enhance compliance tracking and documentation. So this is just kind of an example of some of the data sharing agreements you can see. There are a lot more that are not on here, lots of different acronyms. Most commonly is the DTUA or a DUA. You have a one-way data sharing agreement, reciprocal, or a collaborative, which are include multi-party. Subawards, we really have tried to steer away from this. So there are subawards that have a data sharing component in them. We try to remove that if at all possible, because when data sharing is tied to a subaward, it can delay funding, and that's the last thing that we want. So if the collaborator is amenable, we try to remove that and proceed with a separate DTUA. And if we're unable to do that, then we expedite these so that funding is not delayed. Clinical trial agreements here, I'm specifically talking to federal funded ones. MOUs, PSAs, we mostly review to assess the need for a DTUA. We have data use and material transfer agreement. That's a combination agreement. And then we have your NIMH data archives forms. The DSA allows you to upload your data to a public repository, and the DUC allows you to remove data to use from a public repository. So I'm going to focus on the DTUA because that's the most common. A lot of the components are comparable in these data sharing agreements in general, but we'll focus on the DTUA. They are project specific and they're detailed. They are between an entity of Brown University Health and usually a contractor, private industry, academic institution, or government or state agency. The data provider generally dictates the template that's used, but not always. We at Brown Health prefer the use of the Federal Demonstration Partnership template, or the FDP template. And the reason for that is it's widely accepted and standardized, and it decreases negotiations and administrative burden. Collaborators, however, may have their own internal requirements and request the use of their own template. Instances of that would be international sites and state agencies. External templates, they're okay. They just may prolong the review process as they often require additional red lines and negotiations. And one thing I just want to mention are some considerations for international collaborations. So if you are planning to collaborate with an international site, one thing to keep in mind regarding data sharing is that we can't always adhere to their foreign compliance requirements and privacy laws. And an example of this would be the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which is a European Union law. We can only accept data that is not regulated by GDPR. So it has to be fully anonymized per their standards, not pseudonymized. Pseudonymized per GDPR is comparable to coded data here in the US, and it is looked at as fully identifiable and subject to their standard contractual clauses, which we cannot be a party to. So just a consideration with international sites that there may be hiccups when it comes to agreements and their requirements and laws. So I'm going to quickly go over the components of the DTUA. And again, we'll use the FDP template just because that's the one we use here. You have the provider and recipient info, which is, it must be the entity listed. So not Brown Health, it has to be Rhode Island, Bradley, Miriam, et cetera. The scientist, provider, or recipient should be the main PI, not a co-I, and also not a student. So if you have a student receiving data or providing the data, it should be the faculty member or a mentor that's listed on this agreement. All of that staff, so co-Is, students, residents, et cetera, they're all covered under provider and recipient personnel, which is actually outlined in the terms and conditions. So they also have access to this data per the agreement, but it should be the main PI or faculty or mentor that's listed. Project title should match your IRB or grant. Agreement term is when the data must be returned or destroyed. Data type, de-identified, limited, or identifiable. The terms and conditions are standardized in the FDP, as I mentioned, which is great. They can't be edited. They can't be removed. If they were, we'd have to remove the FDP moniker in that case, but that's why we like this template. Signature page, you don't have to worry about. We take care of that. This is just a screenshot of the next components I'll talk about, project-specific information. So attachment 1, description of data, we're looking for the data type. We always ask for in our review a comprehensive list of data fields to be transferred. That can be in the form of a codebook, data dictionary, or actually just listing out these data fields in the agreement. Who will gather the data? How will they gather it? And from where? What are the methods for de-identification if applicable? If you're transferring PHI or PII, which of the 18 identifiers will be included? And usually in this section, we note the name of the study the data was obtained under and the IRB net ID. Description of project is self-explanatory, the scope of work, how will the data be used by the recipient. Data transmission, you'll have the contact information of the recipient scientist and details regarding mechanism of transfer and storage and security. Disposition requirements, how long will the recipient be permitted to use the data? What will happen after that time? One thing to consider here are public access requirements. So that pertains to NIH public data sharing. That will not be impacted by the disposition requirement. So it's good to put a little blurb in there if there are public access requirements. Attachment 2, which is generally inserted by grants and contracts, are data-specific terms and conditions specific to the data type. And then the last section is collaborator personnel. So will there be any collaborator personnel or third parties permitted to access your data? This does not, again, include provider or recipient personnel. It's anybody outside of the 2 parties listed in this agreement. Again, a couple screenshots of those sections for you. Attachment 2, the data-specific terms and the collaborator personnel. Some HRPP considerations and resources. So a big part of our review includes going through thoroughly through IRB Net, soon to be Huron, and all of your IRB documentation. So we're looking for consistency between the consent protocol and your data sharing agreement. Main elements we're looking for in the IRB: where are the data going? What is the data type? What's the mechanism of transfer, storage, security, information, and noting that a DTUA will be executed prior to transfer. Other considerations: the number of transfers. Is this an ongoing transfer? Is it a one-time transfer? The method of obtaining data. Is it an IS data extract, manual chart abstraction, and your process for de-identification if applicable. There is a link here to schedule a consult with Allie Jean and or Claire Walker if necessary. We have a lot of combo consults with them to streamline communication and ensure everybody's on the same page. And then while we're talking about HRPP considerations, one big question I get from researchers is, I have consented research, the participants consented, why do I need a DTUA if they're consenting? And I just wanted to quickly discuss the difference between permission pathway versus Brown Health's DTUA requirements, which is separate from HIPAA's DUA requirements related to a limited data set. But the informed consent allows or gives permission to share. The data use agreement governs a lot more than that, as you can see here. It defines the parties, the data type and description, terms and conditions, scope of work, costs and reimbursements, privacy and confidentiality, ownership, publications, safeguards and notifications, data security, permitted use and restrictions, intellectual property, disposition requirements, and liability provisions. So it's really important to have both of those in place to protect the data. And one thing to note here too, another big question I get is I am not sending EHR data. No EHR data is being transmitted, but all data that is created by our researchers and our research here at Brown Health belongs to Brown University Health unless otherwise specified. Some IS considerations. So one thing I'll mention is regardless of the need for a DTUA, so for instance, let's say you are the recipient of the data only and your collaborator does not require a DTUA, I still want you to think about the IS component of this, so mechanism of transfer, storage, and security, because that's still important. File size and data type will determine those. There's different mechanisms and storage that you're going to use depending on the size and the type. Study applications generally also have an ancillary review by IS. The preferred mechanisms of transfer by IS are encrypted email if it's under 50 gigs and secure file transfer protocol, or SFTP, if it's over 50 gigs, or if you have ongoing transfers, it's also preferred. Some helpful links here: IS consultation request, the SFTP request, data storage and sharing pages on the internet. And then another important one is the unblock website request. This is specific to cloud share repositories, which I'll talk about on another slide. Another thing I wanted to mention is biospecimen data considerations. So this is something that has actually come up recently that we're trying to manage, and that is data associated with specimens. So oftentimes the data associated with specimens is not covered in an MTA. An MTA only covers the material transfer only. Unless it is a combination agreement, as I mentioned, there are those data use and material transfer agreements. And when we're talking about data, it can be either data on the actual tube itself or specimen itself on the label, an accompanying manifest, or associated clinical data. And while we're talking about this, I wanted to also mention dates, because that's one of the biggest things we see with researchers who come to us and say, I plan to share a completely de-identified data set, and come to find out dates are included. So dates constitute a limited data set. And it's not just date of birth or date of death, et cetera. It's all dates that are directly tied to an individual, all elements of date that are smaller than a year. So a lot of times biospecimens do have date, at least date of collection. They may even have date of birth on them, age, et cetera. So that data needs to be covered, and MTAs do not currently come through DPSP. We're hoping, again, similar to industry, to incorporate that in at some point, but we haven't yet. We do handle the data component, however. So one thing is, if you know you're sharing samples, it's good to come through us so we can review all applicable agreements. Sometimes it can be covered in a collaboration agreement, a service agreement. We will look through those and see and ensure that it is covered. Consider the necessity for a BAA depending on the vendor and the service they're providing. And if it isn't covered in one of those agreements, we will begin the DTUA process to cover the data associated with specimens. Some other considerations, common questions and kind of topics that come up. Free text fields and notes are inherently identifiable, and the reason for that is they are not discrete fields, so you can enter anything into them. I kind of look at it in two different categories. You have your AI, natural language processing, and machine learning category, which I'm trying to advocate right now for the research community, because currently right now, it's a hard no to send that data outside of the institution, because it's a large amount of notes fields that are included in that. And then you have your other free text fields, like in a REDCap project, for instance, whether it's a multiple choice and then an other field, or describe your symptoms, et cetera. If, depending on the participants and the records and the study staff, if it is reasonable for the study staff to go through and review those, it's a case-by-case basis, but we can add an attestation in the DTUA noting that they will be reviewed by the study staff. If you're trying to send a fully de-identified data set, is what this pertains to. Imaging data is another big one that we see and have been handling, specifically neuroimaging data, but DICOMs, we're going to be looking at de-identification and defacing if it's neuroimaging, and DICOMs just in general for all other imaging. Data can hide in numerous places with imaging data, so file names, metadata, editable text, and burned-in text. So it's important that those get thoroughly reviewed. Right now, for neuroimaging data, De-identification can be done by the file room, and also Scott Collins is performing the defacing work. We do have some new software that we're testing, which would be great if it ends up working out and can be utilized in the community. Coded data and documentation. So just a note on this, we need to make sure there's an attestation in the DTUA, which the FTB template, it's baked into those data specific terms usually, but if it's an external template, we need to be sure that we are attesting to the fact that the key is staying here at Brown Health and it is not being shared with the collaborator. Cloud share repositories, which I touched on earlier. So these are your Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, Amazon S3, et cetera. There's a bunch of them. Most of those require an IS review and approval, which was that website unblock link I had earlier. The one thing to note about these, particularly if PHI is being shared, it's a one-time use, so it's project specific. So if you submit a ticket to IS and you're approved to use Google Drive for that particular project, and you decide you want to use it for another one, you need to submit another ticket for IS to review, because they may approve a ticket for you to share de-identified data, and now you're going to be sharing PHI for a separate project. So that's important. Video and audio recordings and transcription. It's another thing that comes up. Audio recordings are kind of the fuzzy area of, are they identifiable? Are they not? Again, it depends on how many recordings we're talking about. How long are the recordings? Is a transcription service being used? Are the recordings being sent or just the transcriptions? Can the study staff feasibly go through and ensure no identifiers have been spoken in an audio recording? PHI and PII to non-covered entities. This is something that comes through our larger group for review, particularly if it is a waiver of consent or authorization. We actually ask for an institutional statement regarding how they protect our data and safeguard the PHI. If it is being sent to a non-covered entity, that's again a case-by-case basis for a waiver. And then public access requirements I discussed with NIH. So one of the million-dollar question is, how long will this take? How long will this review take in total? And it's a really tough one to answer, but I'll quickly discuss kind of the factors that impact speed. The one thing I'll say is it's just myself and my colleague Evelyn Namaja who are doing these reviews. We certainly need help and hoping to have that in the future. But Evelyn was actually temporarily came on to help with DPSP to try to cut through the backlog. When I inherited this last year, we had a huge backlog that we inherited, and we've only had a steady stream of submissions since. And we have unfortunately been unable to get through that backlog. But a couple different factors that impact speed: knowledge and experience of the PI and study team, the data management and sharing plan. Is the plan clear? Is the information readily accessible? That's usually not the case. The size of our queue, your place in the queue, and our backlog, as I mentioned. The actual review itself and the time that takes. So validating those details, ensuring consistency between your DTUA, IRB, and your plan, peeling back those layers, delays between iterations of back and forth, which I try to eliminate. So if there's any editing that needs to be done to the DTUA, I'll do that myself as to avoid any back and forth. Changes to the plan and new questions or issues that may arise. IRB approval and or revisions and IS approval. So are there details or documents missing? Has there been a change in data type or plan? Any details related to mechanism of transfer and storage? Are there Avanti tickets outstanding that require approval? Scheduling and bandwidth. And then lastly, red lines, negotiations, and signatures. That process is variable. I will say Grants and Contracts does a fantastic job of getting these out the door when we send them to them. And then when they get to the other institution, it's really in their hands at that point. It could be days, weeks, months that it takes them to sign. I'd say most commonly it's in the weeks range, but it just depends on the external institution. One thing I'll note here is we prioritize submissions with time constraints within reason. So I don't know what I don't know. Please tell me if you have a deadline or a time constraint, because we do everything we can to prioritize that to get it done for you. The goal is to eliminate any delays in funding and support participation in research. And again, like I said, within reason. If you come to me and say you need it done in 2 weeks, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be feasible. That's why the earlier you come to us, the better. But we do everything we can. This is just a little screenshot of our dashboard. This actually takes data from our database, kind of just gives a little overview of how many we have churning, how many are out for execution, how many reviews are in process, some that we haven't even touched, et cetera, and then how many executions we have per month. And then lastly, what are the steps? So you know you need to share your data. what do you do? So the step one is completing our DPSP submission form. It's our REDCap survey. You can either, when you get to the landing page, you can either decide to book a consultation with us from there or complete the form and enter the queue if you've done this before or you're confident. There's a helpful guide on there as well on the landing page, and I encourage using that. And I actually want to edit it with some of the information in this presentation as well. Same thing with the REDCap survey. I'm trying to kind of revamp that to make it easier for researchers. Steps 2 and 3, so the internal review process. Right now, we're giving an approximate 4 to 6 week timeline from submission to the beginning of our review. However, we are backlogged, and I think that's a little bit longer than I'd like it to be, unfortunately, right now, but we're trying our best. Birdie conducts the initial review and collaborates with our larger group. Concordance with IRB protocol, consent, consultation, we coordinate ancillary reviews and solutions. We validate fields for level of de-identification, document, track, and help edit the DTUA. Revisions are often required to the data management and sharing plan, the DTUA, and IRB documents to meet regulatory or institutional standards. Once the draft of your data sharing agreement is good to go, Birdie will send that final draft to grants and contracts, CC the PI and study contact if applicable, and then red lines and negotiations will occur as necessary, and they will route for signatures from the PIs and authorized officials at both institutions. And then lastly, you have your receipt of your fully executed agreement, which will give you the green light to send the data. In addition to full IRB approval, one thing I'll mention here is they can happen in parallel. So you don't need to have IRB approval before we will process your DTUA. We can do them at the same time, provided all details are consistent between both. That way, one's not holding up the other. Lastly, here is just a resource page. So again, our REDCap survey, our submission form, our booking link, separate from the REDCap. If you want to book with us, any questions can be directed to myself or Evelyn. BAAs, if you need information on that, the BAA email is here, as well as the report, which will list all the vendors that have an executed BAA in place currently. Our Birdie website, the FDP DTUA resources, and the HHS guidance regarding de-identification. And because we work so closely with Brown University, I also have their emails here as well. All three of these emails go to the same inbox related to data sharing and MTAs. And then lastly, we will do a little Q&A if anyone has any questions, and I will do my best to answer them. And if I don't have the answer, I will find it for you, do my best to find it for you.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, there was a lot there. There's probably some questions either from folks in the room or folks online. If you're online, you can either type a question in the chat or raise your hand. I can't see either, but the people in the room on computers who can. So just please, and I assume these slides we have and will make available to everyone who is registered. There's a lot of good resources there that with the people.
And we're happy to meet too. So like I said, consult to discuss, your actual plan, or even if you just have more questions about the process, please schedule with us, email us, happy to answer any of your questions.
And what is the timeline for that? So if I say, yes, I'm planning on project and I want to chat for a consultation, is that weeks, is that months, or how soon can I kind of start the process with consulting with you or wherever?
Like how soon can you get a consult? Is that the question?
Yeah.
With us, pretty like as soon as possible. So my booking link is linked to my team's calendar. So there's this week, for instance, would be booked, but there should be availability for next week. So as soon as the following week, and honestly, if for some reason in my booking link, if it's booked up and you need to talk sooner, just email me and I can make time in my schedule to meet with you.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Are there any examples of DTUAs or DUAs with the type of language that you're looking for that we can access?
So like one that's already been done?
Yeah.
So there's not one, we can't really share because these are legal contracts that are done between two different parties. So we can't really give one that's already been done. If you know a colleague who's already done this and they'd want to share it with you, you can ask them for that. But my guide, so the helpful guide that I have on that landing page will actually like I did in this presentation, walk you through exactly what we look for in each one of those sections in the FTP template. So it'll have everything you're looking for. That, and like I said, I'm also happy to meet with you and we can open up the FTP template and I'll walk you through each step as well. The one thing I'll tell you is if you take a stab at it and you submit it to me, like I mentioned, if it needs editing, things are in the wrong spot, or if it's missing information, I will do that for you at that point. Once you've submitted it to me, I will kind of do all the editing work on the back end that needs to be done.
The question. Anything online? No. All right, well, great. We'll hear from the folks in the room. We appreciate you giving us all that information.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, I think we've got one question that just came up.
Actually, it seems like a question did pop up in the chat.
Can you
Yes.
explain a bit more about the need for a D2A for de-identified data or data that is made publicly available?
Yep. So right now, and this is something I'm actually working on, we do require DTUAs for completely de-identified data. And that is an institutional policy that we have that I'm actually trying to eliminate the need for. We will still, if we do, or if we are able to get rid of the need to do a DTUA for completely de-identified data, we still will validate the fields for de-identification, but then hopefully we won't need to proceed with the actual agreement. That's something we're in talks with Barat and compliance and legal to see if that's an option. As far as data that's made publicly available, so that's what I was talking about, public access requirements. If there's any component where you're sharing this data, which as we know with NIH, it's a requirement, that data is not subject to the DTUA. So if you know that in your project, you're going to have to share data for NIH or what have you, there's a section in the disposition requirements and in the description of project where you'll speak to those public access requirements, and that data can be shared as needed publicly.
All right, well, thank you very much, Heather. I think we'll go on. Our next speaker is also going to join us online. We'll actually